Hello, I'm Ben Wattenberg. If you don't like the current crop of Republican presidential hopefuls and you aren't satisfied with Bill Clinton, fear not. You may have a third choice. 4 years ago, Ross Perot won 19% of the vote. Will Ross the boss try again? How about Jesse Jackson or Bill Bradley? What about Ralph Nader? What about Pat Buchanan if he doesn't like the Republican nominee? What about Colin Powell if Buchanan is the Republican nominee? Off the wall, stranger things have happened. Joining us to examine the role third parties play in American politics are Stephen Rosenstone, director of the National Election Center at the University of Michigan and co-author of Third Parties in America, Citizen Response to Major Party Failure. Gordon Black, author of The Politics of American Discontent, How a New Party Can Make Democracy Work Again. Ronald Walters, chairman of the Political Science Department at Howard University and author of Black Presidential Politics in America. And David Gergen, former advisor to Presidents Reagan and Clinton and visiting professor of public policy at Duke University. The topic before this House, will there be a third choice in 1996? This week on Think Tank. Third-party candidates often identify a new concern among voters and place it on the national agenda. Such challengers tend to reshape and renew the major parties. Third-party candidates have included Republican John C. Fremont, who lost in 1856, Bull Moose candidate Theodore Roosevelt, who lost in 1912, progressive candidate Henry Wallace, who lost in 1948, states' rights candidate Strom Thurmond, who also lost in 1948, George Wallace, who lost in 1968, and John Anderson, who lost in 1980. But were these men losers? They didn't win, but they did change American politics. And oh yes, one third-choice candidate won in 1860, Abraham Lincoln. In Dallas, in the summer of 1995, it was apparent that many voters who supported Ross Perot in 1992 were still unhappy with the major parties.
I think both parties have failed in a lot of ways, and we sometimes wish that we could have another party.
We're supposed to be here telling the politicians, we're not happy with you.
If they get away from the moral issues or the family value issues, I definitely see a third party.
Unhappiness with the two major parties is growing. In January of 1992, 33% of voters identified themselves as independents. But by January of 1996, it was up to 41%. Ross Perot says he once again hears the ongoing growl of discontent. He is launching a third party for the 1996 election. Perot's Reform Party is already on the ballot in several states, including the big one, California. Come November, they say their candidate will be eligible in all 50 states. And other political independents are out there. Jesse Jackson could run on a new Liberal Party line. Ralph Nader is already on the ballot in California as the candidate of the Green Party. There is speculation that Senator Bill Bradley might run. In fact, there are more than a few people who are willing to serve their country as president. First question to you, Professor Stephen Rosenstone. How likely do you think it will be that we will have a third party in 1996?
There's no doubt there'll be a third party in 1996.
A major third party?
Well, major depends on lots of things. The message, without the money, without the media, and without access to the debates, has an awful lot to do with deciding whether it's going to be major of the proportion of Ross Perot or minor of the proportion of John Anderson. Given the way the laws are written, candidates that have lots of money that is their own, billionaires, stand a great advantage to be major party candidates, to use your language. It's hard to imagine 1992 producing the vote that Ross Perot got without the access to the media, without the millions of dollars, without the access to the debates. And that's a deciding factor in 1996.
Okay. Gordon Black, you have worked in the past with Ross Perot. Do you think he's going to be a player?
Absolutely. I mean, I don't think there's any question about it. He's behaved in a very consistent manner over the last 4 years. He tried United We Stand. It didn't work the way he wanted it to. And he's going down this tack, and he's putting in enough funds that it's going to happen. I mean, it was always just a matter of money in the sense that these election laws are designed to try to keep people off, but if you have enough resources, you can get people on. And there's certainly enough people out there willing to support the effort.
Dave Gergen, in 1992, you got the number of scoops from Perot himself. What do you think it looks like?
Well, Ben, anything can happen this year, and some people think it already has, starting in New Hampshire. But people close to Ross Perot tell me he is very, very unlikely to run himself this year. One circumstance under which I could see him running would be if Pat Buchanan or someone like him were to become the Republican nominee and was seen as a non-viable candidate by whatever standard, and Pat may be very viable by that point, but if he were non-viable and the country were somehow calling, then I could see the possibility of Ross Perot stepping in.
Ron Walters, what do you think Reverend Jackson is going to do? Is he going to be a player?
Well, he's certainly going to be a player, but I don't know whether or not he's going to run for president. I think he spent a good part of time trying to keep Bill Clinton's feet to the fire, trying to pull him back to what we call the mainstream of the Democratic Party's tradition. But since
Not
the
what
election,
I would call the mainstream. We were having that little argument, right? Okay, right.
But since 1994, I think with the upsurge of what we call radical republicanism, I think that the threat on the right is such that I don't think Reverend Jackson will experiment in 1996. I think the pressure is inexorable on all Democrats to try to pull together in order to turn the Congress back to the Democratic Party and to try to help Bill Clinton win the presidency. And I think that pressure is really building at this point.
All right, what about, I mean, wouldn't the same sort of pressures be on Ralph Nader to stay off the ballot in California? Last I saw, he was picking up 7-8%. That could take that state from Clinton. Clinton loses California. There goes the ball game. Have you heard anything, Dave, Gordon?
No, but have you ever known Ralph Nader to bow to that kind of pressure?
No.
Yeah, that's why I would assume he'd press on.
And conceivably cost Clinton California.
If it's a highly competitive race. At this moment, there are many in the White House, of course, who think the gap is widening and the president is more likely to win by a large margin. I know that you disagree with that, and I know many other Republicans disagree with that. But after New Hampshire, you know, I think that I still think it's going to be a very competitive race. In which case, Ralph Nader could have a very big impact. But I think that possibility is opened up. That it could be a wide open. You know, the president could win by a large margin.
Let's just play out a couple of scenarios. What happens if Buchanan wins the Republican nomination?
It would detach a significant chunk of the Republican Party into Perot's camp. So almost immediately.
Into Perot's camp, or might there be
It won't cross over. It will not cross over to Clinton.
No, wait a minute. You're going to let me finish. Might there then be another third party of the center, perhaps using Perot's line, which he has said, oh, I don't want to, I mean, for example, if Pat Buchanan were the nominee, there'd be a lot of people knocking on Colin Powell's door saying, now you ought to run a third party.
But I don't think you're going to know whether he's going to be the nominee to the very end, and if it comes out at the end, it's too late to do much about it one way or the other.
I think the other thing you're forgetting here, Ben, is that there's entry costs, and the entry costs are not free to everybody. The entry costs to Ross Perot, in some sense, are much lower than the entry cost to Colin Powell.
Yeah.
Coming in late in the game, without having the capacity to sit and write a $70 million check from your bank account, makes it a little more difficult for you to jump in at the last minute and say, suddenly now there's a hole here in the middle, I'm going to jump in and think I can take it. There's ballot access problems. $12 million spent, $18 million spent in 1992 just on ballot access. We're up around $25 million budget right now for ballot access for Perot in 1996. That has to be done, and we know how complicated that process is. You need in the neighborhood of $40 to $50 million in the last couple of weeks of the campaign to compete at the national level with the major parties. On the media front, you need to capture the media attention that Perot cleverly was able to do, and you got to get yourself a ticket to those presidential debates. And those are part of the calculations about whether you're going to jump in, and not everybody's going to get access to all the hurdles they need to jump there in order to really be a player.
Isn't it? I mean, we have seen in the major party primaries where the entry costs are also extremely high, some players Reverend Jackson, Pat Buchanan, Jerry Brown, Pat Robertson have succeeded in living off the land and doing very, very well and gaining enough lift from free media to become serious candidates. I mean, is that...
Well, Ben, the problem is it's far cry 3 or 4 states or 5 or 6 states or 10 states and 50 states. I mean, if you're going to be a viable candidate, you have to have a strategy that's going to get you on the ballot in 50 states. And that means you really have to be started, certainly now, in order to qualify as an independent candidate. It's not simple. And think about 1992. Perot did it with probably one of the great outpourings of public support in modern politics.
Well, and $18 million.
And he barely did it.
You know? And $18 million.
And $18 million, right. I mean, this is such just incredibly complicated process.
Yeah, Ben, I may be wrong about this, but my working assumption right now is, with the possible exception of General Powell, there is no third-party candidate who could emerge who can win the presidency this year. I don't see it happening. I think the only real question is what the third-party candidate does to the other two. For the most part, any third-party candidate helps Bill Clinton. It's especially true if it's someone like Ross Perot. Only Jesse Jackson and Ralph Nader getting in can hurt Bill Clinton. Anybody else helps Clinton. I wanted to ask Gordon something, because by this time, I believe 4 years ago, Ross Perot started to move. I think his interview with Larry King was
Late February.
Late February, so it wasn't just about around this time when he indicated his interest. And again, I don't think he's that interested. I'm curious to know what he's going to do with his third party this year if he does not run personally.
Well,
It becomes a vehicle for whom?
I don't think there is another candidate besides him. That's been the discussion, and I mean, there are a lot of people who'd like to have another candidate beside him, but I don't think there is one, and I think in the end,
Mike Perot, for example, asked former Senator David Boren, who was I think the keynote introducer at his, what they call the Pander Party in Dallas.
And they're friends.
And they're close
and they're very good friends. Right. And I would be inclined to think that the real issue is who's going to be the vice presidential candidate, and he would be very high on the list. Yeah. But the reality is that unless they move very quickly, they can't finance it. And that's also another major
Let me ask this
problem.
question. Let's just play a little scenario here. Let us say, for example, no budget is passed, and Pat Buchanan really shakes up the Republican Party, and every kind of mud and scandal is dropped on the Clintons. Ross Perot then comes in and he says, these clowns can't even pass a budget.
They can't govern.
They can't govern.
Which is the argument against him that they made in '92, right, coming back to haunt them.
Could Perot, Dave, you're the skeptic here, could Perot, take my scenario.
I thought that was, I said at the beginning, I thought the one scenario in which I could see Perot getting in would be if the Republicans were to nominate Buchanan and the country, in effect, was beckoning in some fashion, or he could argue plausibly that the country was beckoning.
All right, next question. We saw the figures on the chart before, why is the number of independents rising so rapidly? You have now what, the numbers we saw is 41% of the people in the United States, the voters, call themselves independents, which is, what, is that a historical high?
No, it's not, and I would like to take issue with some of those numbers because I think they're not quite the whole story.
Okay.
Part of the problem is
that this program is for.
Part of the problem is that if you ask those independents a follow-up question, do you consider yourself closer to the Democratic or Republican Party? Over 2/3 of the people you want to call independents are actually closet partisans.
I'm just trying to figure out and get things moving here, but that's all right. You go ahead.
And the people, when they split themselves out, over 2/3 of them will either say I'm a Democrat or Republican to this follow-up question, and you know what? They have issue positions and voting patterns that look just like Democrats and Republicans. In fact, the number of strong partisans right now are higher than they've ever been since 1964, and the number of, quote, pure independents, those that don't have this clause of allegiance, that don't lean to one party or the other, are the lowest they've been since 1964. If anything, the signs are that we've not had a groundswell of independence since 1980. It's been relatively flat since 1980. It's been 2 decades of about the same allegiance to the Democratic and Republican Party, about the same satisfaction with the major party candidates.
I'm going to disagree.
Yeah, I'm too.
You're asking this question, if you give them the follow-up question, the reality of that follow-up question is that essentially people will answer a question if you give it to them. If there are only 2 choices on the plate, and you say, which of the two choices do you tend to be closer to, almost everybody's going to have an answer to that question. Does that mean loyalty or affection or a sense of affinity? I disagree absolutely.
You think this rise of voters who self-identify as independents, that's for real?
I think it's for real. I think it's a loss of affection for the parties. And the alienation index by Harris has been is at 67%. It's the highest it's ever been since 1966. There are a lot of other indicators that indicate the poll questions on third parties, which Gallup has been asking since 1937. In the 60s period, we're in the 20s. In the 80 periods, we're in the 40s, and they're now in the 60s.
The problem with those questions is those are not the same questions across those decades. Those questions have changed.
Slightly, but not
enough
much.
That Survey Research 101 has taught us that if you want to monitor change, you can't change your questions over the years.
Ron Walters, Howard University.
I agree with Steve that when you look at actual voting behavior, about 13% of those people are actually what's called pure independents. But the point here, I think, is being missed. What we have really, regardless of what people call themselves, is a shifting pattern in political behavior, which is to say that the people who used to call themselves Democrats don't act like pure Democrats anymore. And to some extent, the same thing is true of Republicans. It is that we're in a period of shifting political behavior and shifting party loyalties.
I think that's a fair assessment, but I think the central point I'm trying to make is don't assume that 41% is A, homogeneous, or B, going to march in unison off to an independent candidate.
I would agree with that, but I think the evidence is very persuasive that there are a lot of angry people in this country, resentful people, insecure people. And I would argue this, that I don't see a third party arising in this election in a serious way in this election cycle. But if the Democratic Party if Clinton were to be reelected and were to govern over on the left, and the Republican Party continues to be seen as more out on the right than people had expected, there is a huge group of people in the center who feel beached, who feel sort of left stranded in this politics. And it's the makings of a serious third party, I think, in the future.
And they weren't beached in 1960.
That's
they weren't
correct.
beached in 1956. They had a choice. Both candidates basically wanted their votes. They went to the center. But that's not happening anymore.
That's right.
That the voters do not have a choice in the center.
Not in the center. I mean,
Bill
main
Clinton
complaint against the
won
party-
because he ran as a centrist.
I understand that's the presumption, but he wasn't perceived very much in that direction. But
In
if you go
92
back
he
to
was,
think about what the critique of the parties prior to 1960, it was that they didn't offer a choice. They only offered Tweedledee, Tweedledum. All the books were written about that, and nobody in their right mind would write that book today, because the parties are so dissimilar in terms of their constituencies and their positions, and the voters pick it up.
Yeah. In fact, that's what was coming out of New Hampshire. A lot of the moderate Republicans up there were saying that nobody's really speaking to them.
Well, there's no self-proclaimed moderate in the race.
That's right.
I mean, there is, Lamar Alexander is seen as the most moderate, and he will never answer he's a moderate.
He's a conservative, right?
David Gergen and I were in New Hampshire last week, and we were in a van with Lamar Alexander, and I inadvertently said something about, well, there are 3 moderates in the race, referring one of them being him, and he immediately said, I'm not a moderate. and yet, all the exit polls we've seen show him getting the votes of the independents and moderates.
All perspectives are relative.
Absolutely. Let me just ask a question about the Buchanan thing. Is it possible that the rise of Pat Buchanan winning New Hampshire, likely running a strong race, probably not getting the Republican nomination, the standard scenario is this is going to split the Republican Party, all the pieces are going to fracture, everything's going to go crazy, it's going to help Clinton. Is it possible that Buchanan could be a bridge to bring in probably lower middle class, blue collar, alienated voters who might well go for the Democrats and bring them into the Republican Party? David Gergen.
I think it's possible. I think he has been a street corner conservative all his life. He's always understood these ethnic voters who came into the Republican with Nixon, and he also certainly understood the Wallace voters. But Ben, I don't know how he does that unless he's the nominee.
Right.
Where it's much harder to be that vehicle or that magnet unless he's the nominee.
He could potentially do it as a vice presidential
He could
candidate to
potentially.
some extent, and would shore up a ticket with a DOLE on it. but I don't think so other than that. I mean, and I don't think that's likely to happen. I think that the DOLE will seem as a liability before this is all over, because again, he chases away the centrist, and if he's going to go after Clinton, he's got to go back in the election to the middle on some of these.
Would Buchanan run a third party if they all dump on him?
Too late. There's a rule also about it that really precludes.
But if he somehow feels cheated out of the nomination, then I think he becomes. If he wins a lot of primaries and it's taken from him.
But Gordon says there's a rule in the Republican Party that you cannot then run.
What is
There's ballot access rules about sore losers.
Yeah, sore losers, right?
Anderson ran into those, and
yeah.
And he
still
could not
can't get
run,
on
or
the ballot.
you can't
right.
get on. You can't get on if you ran in the primary and lost. You ran in the primary. You can't in some states get on the ballot as an independent.
Right.
All right, Ron Walters, what do you think is going to be the upshot of this Buchanan situation?
Well, I think that a lot of it depends upon how tolerant his backers are. He's allied to a wing of the party which is many people see as intolerant, and the question is whether or not they will tolerate him, because if he's going to be a vice president, he's going to have to accept a lot of a theoretical president's agenda. And so, is that a marriage? Can there be a marriage? I don't think there can be.
Yeah, I wasn't talking of him as a vice president. I was talking of him looking to his own future, saying, if I can bring these people into the Republican Party without causing a fracture, I'm a hero. If not, I'm a bum. I'd rather be a hero because 4 years or 8 years from now, I would like to run. What do you think?
I think the biggest impact is the same kind of impact that Perot did, which was to shape the agenda of the debate, to force the parties to talk about things they didn't want to get issues on that otherwise would not have been on the agenda. That's a powerful impact, and I think that's probably the one he's most likely to have in '96.
All right, last go around, real quick. Are third parties and the threat thereof good for America?
I think it's been healthy to shake up our politics from time to time. As Jefferson said, a little revolution every 20 years is a good thing.
I think if you look at the history of third parties, in general, they have played a very favorable role, but not always.
Ron?
Third parties are a good indication of some of the splits in society and how various issues are playing, and I think they give us a good sort of read as to what's actually going on in political terms.
It's a wake-up call to the major parties. It's when they ignore issues, don't pay attention to issues that a lot of people care an awful lot about, parties that come around to champion them. That is a nice safety valve, and as David suggested, the American version of revolution.
Okay, thank you, David Gergen, Stephen Rosenstone, Gordon Black, and Ronald Walters, and thank you. Now it is my pleasure to announce the winners of our contest to create bumper stickers for or against President Clinton. After sorting through hundreds of entries, we have some winners. First, the anti-Clinton entries, which are more numerous because, as the recent primary showed, it's easier to go negative. The runners-up are number 6, Nix the Slicks in 96. Number 5, Free Willy, vote for Dole. Number 4, Clinton Gone 96. Number 3, Stop and Smell the Rose Law Firm. Number 2, Clinton's White House, George Washington WEPT here. And the winner is from Ms. Norma Smith of Chicago, Illinois, Clinton 99% fact-free. Now, on the positive side, the runner-up in support of President Clinton reads, Clinton sax beats Dole drums. Oof. And remembering that this is a negative era, the winner is David Wool of Bayside, New York, who writes, End GOP upheaval, support the lesser evil. Vote Clinton. Our 2 winners will receive a political package which includes videotapes of this program, the new PBS documentary, A Third Choice, about the history of third parties, autographed copies of my new book, Values Matter Most, and its companion PBS documentary. And don't worry, Democrats, as soon as the Republicans choose their nominee, you too will get a chance to go negative when we do part 2 of our bumper sticker contest. Please send your comments and questions to New River Media, 1150 17th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036. We can also be reached by email at thinktv@aol.com or on the World Wide Web at www.thinktank.com. For Think Tank, I'm Ben Wattenberg.
This has been a production of BJW Incorporated in association with New River Media, which are solely responsible for its content.